Sawyer Langley stood outside the courthouse in a jacket still smelling of motor oil, watching his ex-wife descend from a Rolls-Royce beside CEO Vaughn Holloway Sterling. Months earlier she had left him, tired of unpaid bills, grease-stained evenings, and a man who refused to climb. Sawyer came today only because a stranger had mailed him a subpoena he couldn't explain. He expected nothing more than a signature and the drive home to his daughter. But when the judge unsealed Preston Mercer's final will, the room fell silent, and the keys to a $4 billion automotive empire were placed in front of him. Stay until the end to understand why a dying billionaire handed his empire to a mechanic no one believed in. The rain had been falling since late afternoon the night Nicole left, coming down in the slow, indifferent way of a Tuesday that had no interest in being dramatic. Sawyer was bent under the hood of a 1968 Pontiac when he heard the creak of the front door and looked up to find Nicole standing in the garage entrance with a bag over her shoulder and a calmness on her face that was more final than any argument they had ever had. She didn't shout and she didn't cry, and that stillness was somehow worse than anything loud would have been, because it told him she had already grieved the decision and moved through it to the other side. She said she was tired of counting to see if they had enough at the end of the month, tired of explaining to her friends why her husband smelled like oil when they went out, tired of watching a man who had real talent refuse to want more than a two-bay garage in a town that barely noticed him. Vaughn Holloway Sterling waited by the car, dressed in the particular way of men who have never needed to check a price tag, his posture carrying that easy confidence that comes not from effort but from never having been told no. Sawyer wiped his hands on a rag and asked Nicole the only question that mattered to him, whether she was sure she wanted to leave Piper behind. Nicole flinched at the name, looked at the floor for a moment, and said their daughter would be better off in a stable house than in the middle of whatever this had become, and that was the closest she came to admitting she had already made peace with walking out on both of them. Vaughn said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence alone was the statement. The gleaming car, the tailored coat, the quiet certainty of a man who had decided that Sawyer Langley was simply a problem that money had already solved. Sawyer didn't raise his voice. He didn't chase the car down the driveway or throw his tools against the wall or call her name into the wet dark. He stood in the garage doorway until the taillights disappeared around the corner, then turned back to the Pontiac, finished what he had started, and went inside to check on Piper, who was asleep with her arm around a stuffed dog she had named after a race car she saw on television once. That night, after he had stood in the kitchen for a long time drinking cold coffee and listening to the rain, Sawyer opened the third drawer of his tool chest and placed his wedding ring inside. It settled beside an old key fob, scratched brass with the embossed logo of Mercer Sterling Motors, that he had kept for years without quite knowing why. By the following week, every person in town seemed to have an opinion about what had happened, and most of those opinions arrived second-hand and slightly wrong, the way small-town gossip always does. Some people were sorry for Sawyer in that performative way that mostly serves the person doing the feeling, stopping by the garage with casseroles and lingering too long, waiting for him to say something they could carry back to their dinner tables. Others were less charitable, making the quiet calculation that Nicole had simply done the math correctly. That when you could choose between a man who fixed other people's cars and the CEO of the company that made them, the choice was obvious to anyone with ambition. Sawyer heard all of it and responded to none of it, because he had a 7-year-old to feed and a business to run and a driveway that needed patching, and none of those things cared whether he was humiliated. He dropped Piper at school every morning, made lunches with more love than creativity, worked until the light faded and sometimes well past it, and on the nights she had trouble sleeping, He sat on the edge of her bed and read to her until her breathing slowed. There was a particular kind of dignity in the way he refused to perform his pain for anyone, and the people who were watching closely enough to notice it didn't say so aloud, because quiet dignity is hard to explain without sounding like you're delivering a eulogy. When a Mercer Sterling advertisement played on the waiting room television at Piper's pediatrician's office, one of those sweeping road commercials with dramatic music and mountain light, Sawyer watched it without expression until it ended, then looked back down at the magazine he wasn't really reading. He had been a test restoration technician at Mercer Sterling Motors before Piper was born, one of a small team that worked directly with the founder on heritage vehicles and experimental builds. He had left after a disagreement he never fully explained to anyone, and in the years since, the company had grown from a respected independent manufacturer into something much larger, noisier, and considerably less honest. What Sawyer had no way of knowing, sitting in that waiting room with its antiseptic smell and outdated magazines, was that Preston Mercer Sterling had never stopped paying attention to the man he once called the most trustworthy set of hands in his entire organization. The subpoena arrived on a Thursday, delivered by a young man in a gray suit who confirmed Sawyer's name twice before handing it over. The document identified him as a named party in the estate proceedings of Preston Mercer Sterling, deceased, and requested his presence at a hearing in 14 days. Sawyer read it 3 times, turned it over as if the back might explain things, and set it on the counter next to the coffee maker. He had no idea why Preston would name him in anything. He assumed it was a formality, maybe a small bequest, a few $100s for an old employee, the kind of thing rich men put in their wills to feel organized. He told himself he would go, get whatever form needed a signature, and be done with the Sterling family permanently. The courthouse on the morning of the hearing was the kind of place where money makes itself visible in the architecture. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, the smell of old paper, and institutional certainty. Sawyer arrived in a suit he had last worn to a funeral, which fit well enough across the shoulders, but had a small ink mark near the left cuff that he had noticed too late that morning to do anything about. The lobby was already crowded with people in better suits, most of them carrying leather portfolios and speaking in the low, deliberate tones of professionals who bill by the hour. He recognized Celeste Mercer near the front, the founder's cousin, and the acting chair of the family trust, a composed woman in her early 50s who had the look of someone who had been managing crises since before Sawyer learned to drive. Garrett Holloway was there too, Vaughn's lead attorney, a man whose face carried the faint, permanent expression of someone who has just remembered you owe him something. And then Nicole walked in, and the air in the room changed the way it does when something shifts from theoretical to real. She was wearing a charcoal dress that Sawyer had never seen, her hair done in a way that took effort, and she entered the room on Vaughn's arm with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent several months learning to belong somewhere expensive. Vaughn scanned the room, found Sawyer, and let his gaze pass over him with the minimal interest one gives a piece of furniture. He leaned close to Nicole and said something, and she didn't laugh, but almost did, that suppressed expression that is sometimes worse. And Sawyer heard enough of the words to understand. Vaughn was predicting he was here to collect a parting gift from the old man, maybe some vintage tools, maybe a sentimental check. Sawyer found a seat near the back, folded his hands, and waited. He was not angry. He was not performing composure. He was simply a man who had learned, through the particular education of a hard few months, that there is no version of this kind of room that bends in your favor unless something extraordinary has already happened behind closed doors. Judge Conrad Hayes entered the room at 9 in the morning exactly, and settled into the bench with the unhurried authority of a man who had been reading final wills for 30 years, and had long since stopped being surprised by what they said. He went through the preliminary matters efficiently: acknowledgement of parties, confirmation of documentation, verification of the will's chain of custody, and the room maintained the polished alertness of people who believe they are about to receive something. The early distributions were unremarkable: charitable endowments, institutional gifts, specific bequests to staff who had served Preston for decades. Vaughn's posture remained confident throughout, the pose of a man waiting for the announcement of something already decided. Nicole kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward. Then Judge Hayes turned to the section labeled Controlling Interest, and the quality of silence in the room changed. The way silence changes when a room full of people all stop breathing at slightly different moments. The judge read without theater, in the flat, precise cadence of a man delivering a legal document, not a monologue. The golden share of Mercer Sterling Motors, constituting controlling veto rights over any sale, merger, or closure of the primary manufacturing facility, along with physical access authority to all prototype storage, all master tooling archives, and the founding patents portfolio, was to be transferred immediately and in full to one Sawyer Langley, formerly of this city, currently of the same address he had held for 11 years. There was a pause of approximately 3 seconds in which the room processed this information collectively and came up empty. Vaughn stood before the echo of his own name had faded from the air, his composure cracking along a fault line he had not known was there. Nicole's expression moved through several things too quickly to name. Celeste Mercer set down her pen very carefully, and Judge Conrad Hayes, without raising his voice, reached to his right and lifted a brushed silver case the size of a hardback book and placed it on the rail in front of Sawyer's Row. Inside, when the clasps were opened, was a set of keys on a single heavy ring: factory keys, prototype keys, archive keys, each one tagged in Preston Mercer Sterling's own handwriting. The judge said, quietly, that the founder had referred to this set as the keys to everything that mattered. The shouting began within minutes of the judge's gavel, and by the time Delaney Brooks, the independent attorney Preston had named in the will to protect its execution, stood to address the court, Garrett Holloway had already filed a verbal objection, used the phrase diminished capacity twice, and implied, without quite stating it, that Sawyer had somehow manipulated an elderly man in his final months. Sawyer sat through this with the stillness of a man who is genuinely more confused than threatened, because he truly had not known any of this was coming, and the shock of it was still moving through him in slow, strange waves. Delaney was precise, unhurried, and prepared in the way of someone who had been anticipating this exact reaction. She directed the court's attention to the video testament. Preston had recorded 6 months before his death. Not an informal message, but a formal declaration made in the presence of 2 independent witnesses and a notary, in which the founder sat at his desk with the deliberate calm of a man who had settled everything in his own mind. Preston spoke for 14 minutes. He said the Sterling family had built something that deserved to outlive its builders, and that in the last 2 years he had watched a man he trusted. His own nephew and the board majority, Vaughn, had assembled. Prepare to strip that thing down to its name and sell the name to a fund that would stamp it on cars assembled overseas by the lowest bidder. He said he had tried to stop it through the board and failed, tried to stop it through legal challenge and been outmaneuvered, and had eventually understood that the only lever strong enough to hold was one that landed in the hands of someone who had no reason to sell and no price that would change that calculus. He said he had known Sawyer Langley for 9 years, had watched him work, had watched him refuse a payment from Vaughn's intermediary. When refusing, it cost him his position at the company and, not long after, contributed to the unraveling of his marriage. Preston said he was not apologizing for the cost Sawyer had paid. He was acknowledging it. and he was asking Sawyer through this instrument to use the golden share to protect what 3 generations of mechanics and designers and line workers had built together. Nicole listened to every word with the concentration of someone doing arithmetic in their head. The man she had left because he would never amount to anything had refused a bribe large enough to change his life, and the most powerful automotive patriarch in the region had made that refusal the cornerstone of his final plan. Vaughn's challenge was formally entered, and a 30-day period was set for Sawyer to demonstrate basic stewardship before any further proceedings. Garrett framed this in the language of prudence, but the intent was clear: find a reason within a month to replace Sawyer with someone manageable. Vaughn saw as they filed out, but he turned once near the door and looked at Sawyer with the particular expression of a man recalculating rather than retreating. The headquarters of Mercer Sterling Motors occupied 6 buildings on a campus at the edge of the city, and when Sawyer pulled into the visitor lot in his 10-year-old pickup and looked at the glass facade and the rows of finished vehicles arranged in the courtyard and the company flag moving slowly over the main entrance, he had the experience many people have when something abstract becomes concrete all at once. An awareness that his life had shifted into a register it was never supposed to reach. Celeste met him at the lobby, efficient and composed, and walked him through the main building without ceremony, explaining in compact sentences what the golden share actually meant in operational terms. He could not be removed from it without a court order, no sale of the company could proceed without his signature, and no closure or transfer of the flagship factory was permitted against his will. What it did not give him was daily management authority. That remained with the interim board pending the outcome of Vaughn's challenge. And what it did not give him was any kind of institutional knowledge about quarterly targets, or bond covenants, or the dozen other financial mechanisms Vaughn had been using to manufacture urgency around the sale. Celeste told him, with the directness of someone who has decided that clarity is more useful than comfort, that Vaughn had spent the better part of 2 years convincing the board and the investors that Quinn's fund was not just smart but necessary, that the company was carrying debt it couldn't service and needed the infusion, that the brand had peaked, that the factory was an anchor rather than an asset. She also told him she had begun to doubt that narrative, but had never been able to identify exactly where the numbers had been shaped to support the conclusion rather than the other way around. Vaughn's formal counter-argument arrived the same afternoon, through Garrett, and it was elegant in the way that well-funded dishonesty usually is. Sawyer was a restoration technician with no managerial experience, no financial background, and no documented relationship with the company in over 4 years. The board had a fiduciary obligation to shareholders that could not be subordinated to the personal preferences of a deceased founder, and the 30-day window should be treated as an opportunity to establish that Sawyer could not adequately represent the interests of a $4 billion enterprise. Sawyer read the document once, set it aside, and asked Celeste if he could see the factory floor. Lawson Drake was 61 years old and had been managing the primary assembly line at Mercer Sterling Motors for 17 of those years, and when Sawyer came through the heavy double doors that separated the executive wing from the manufacturing floor, Lawson looked at him for a long moment before crossing the concrete and shaking his hand with the grip of a man who has spent decades doing work that actually matters. They had known each other in the earlier years, when Sawyer was running test restorations on heritage vehicles, and Lawson was already the kind of presence on the floor that everyone oriented around without being asked to. Brielle Dawson was there too, the lead structural engineer, 34 years old and skeptical in the productive way. She shook Sawyer's hand, gave him a look that said she was withholding judgment, and said nothing beyond a professional greeting. Sawyer did not ask for a presentation. He walked the line. He listened to the rhythm of the machinery and the intervals between sounds, the way a musician listens to a recording and hears the edits. He stopped at a welding station, examined a seam, asked about the current filler spec, and got an answer that didn't match the grade he would have used. He stopped at a suspension assembly bay, picked up a bushing, turned it over, asked where the previous supplier had gone. Betrayal watched him with an expression that shifted incrementally from assessment to attention. Near the end of the line, Sawyer stopped at a partially assembled Mercer Sterling Vera, the flagship model set for its next production run, and placed his palm flat against the lower door frame and felt the micro-vibration that the line was generating. He asked Lawson how long the frame resonance issue had been present. Lawson said they'd been told it was within tolerance. Sawyer said it wasn't, and that if the Vera went to consumers with this damping material, the warranty claims alone would be measurable in 8 figures. Betrayal pulled up the production change log on her tablet and found the bushing substitution. A lower-grade composite approved 18 months ago by Vaughn's office under a cost reduction initiative. The margin improvement per unit was documented. The structural consequence was not. Sawyer requested that the current Vera production run be halted pending a full material audit. Vaughn's team had the request in their inbox within 20 minutes, and the reply, framed as concern about disruption, arrived before the hour was out. Lawson waited until Betrayal had stepped away before reaching into the inside pocket of his work coat and producing a folded sheet of paper. A summary he had compiled over the previous 2 years, documenting every production specification change that had come through Vaughn's channel, the original quality rating versus the substituted material, and the cumulative cost reduction. It ran to 3 pages. He handed it to Sawyer without a word, the way men who are careful about documentation hand over things they have been waiting a long time to give to the right person. Nicole came to the garage the following evening, after Piper was in bed, parking a car that was not the Rolls-Royce, something more ordinary, which might have meant something or might have meant nothing, and Sawyer was too tired to interpret the symbolism. She stood in the entrance the same way she had the night she left, which was probably unconscious, and he noted it without mentioning it. She said she had not known about the will, and he believed her. She said Vaughn had told her Sawyer was a man who had burned his own bridges at Mercer Sterling by being difficult, that Preston had kept him at arm's length for years, that any connection between them was ancient history with no practical weight. She said she had believed it because she had wanted a reason that wasn't just about money, a narrative that made her choice into something more defensible than ambition. Sawyer leaned against the workbench and let her finish. He was not performing patience, and he was not building toward a confrontation. He was genuinely, simply tired, the way you are when grief has moved through its acute phase and settled into something chronic and manageable. He said he didn't think she had been purely deceived, because deception requires a person to believe something they have no reason to believe, and she had known him well enough for 9 years to know the kind of man he was. He said that wasn't an accusation. It was just an observation that the story Vaughn offered had been convenient in a way that pure lies rarely are. She didn't argue with him. She asked if he was going to be all right, and he almost laughed because the question was both genuine and beside the point. He was going to be all right. He had Piper and a factory to protect and more work ahead of him than he had faced in any previous chapter of his life. What he was not going to do was revisit a marriage that had broken along lines of character, not circumstance. Near the end of the conversation, almost as an aside, Nicole mentioned that Vaughn had said something, weeks before the will was read, before Preston even died, about Sawyer never setting foot in the building again. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now she did. The sentence stayed with Sawyer after she left, expanding the way that one specific detail always does when it lands in the middle of a larger pattern. Vaughn had known, or suspected, or been warned. Someone had told him that Preston's final arrangements included Sawyer, and Vaughn had been moving to preempt them long before the hearing room ever assembled. The prototype storage facility was a separate structure at the back of the campus, temperature-controlled and security-keyed, and when Sawyer used the brass key from Preston's set to open the main door, the interior smell hit him in a way that was almost physical. Old rubber, preservation oil, the particular dry warmth of a room that has been carefully sealed around something valuable for a long time. There were 11 vehicles under white covers, arranged in 2 rows, each one tagged at the front wheel with a laminated card in Preston's small, architectural handwriting. The first 6 were heritage restoration pieces, vehicles the founder had personally supervised, each one a chapter of the brand's story. The 7th was the one Sawyer had come to see. The Mercer Avalon one had been classified internally as a development failure, a project that had consumed 3 years and a significant portion of the research budget before being shelved as commercially unviable. The official record said it had structural and performance deficiencies that made it unsuitable for production. Sawyer pulled the cover off slowly and stood looking at it for a long time before he touched anything. It was a fastback coupe in deep gunmetal with the long proportions and restrained detailing of a car designed by someone who understood that confidence doesn't need to announce itself. He walked around it once, then crouched at the rear quarter panel and ran his fingers along the seam lines. Precise, consistent, nothing like a car that had been failing. He opened the driver's door, sat down, and placed his hands on the wheel. The interior was complete and coherent, the kind of coherent that doesn't happen in a project that's dying. He popped the hood. The engine bay was intact but visibly incomplete. 2 mounting brackets with nothing bolted to them, wiring harness connectors with their terminal pins carefully removed. Someone had extracted a control module, not failed to install it. Extracted it after the fact, with care. In the glove box, folded inside an oil-stained chamois that looked like it had been placed there deliberately, was an envelope in Preston's handwriting. The letter inside was 4 paragraphs. In language that was practical rather than sentimental, the founder explained that the Avalon one had not failed. It had been dismantled. Vaughn and Garrett had understood that if the vehicle performed as designed, it would demonstrate a proprietary platform architecture that would make the company's real asset value roughly double the current book price, and a company worth $8 billion could not be sold at $4 billion without somebody going to prison. The missing module and the core schematics had been transferred via a freight contract Garrett controlled to a shell company called Holloway Mobility Trust. Preston wrote that he had not been able to move on this legally before Elle's health prevented him from doing so. He wrote that he had left Sawyer the key to this room because a man who understands machinery would recognize immediately what a man who only understands contracts might miss entirely. He wrote, in the last line, that he hoped the car still had most of its story left to tell. Betrayal, when Sawyer brought her to the storage facility the following morning, spent 40 minutes with the Avalon before she said anything. Then she pulled up a patent registry on her phone and showed Sawyer a filing from Holloway Mobility Trust, dated 14 months ago, for a drivetrain management architecture that matched the technical specifications in the Avalon's original design brief almost component by component. It was not identical. It was close enough. The 30 days moved quickly in the way that compressed time always does when the work is real and the stakes are not abstract. Vaughn's team made noise in the media. A business correspondent ran a story about a billion-dollar mechanic being handed the controls of a legacy automaker with no operational experience, and the framing was not kind. Sterling Quinn's office issued a statement that the investment fund's interest in Mercer Sterling was contingent on governance stability, which was a polite way of saying that the current situation was making them impatient. Garrett filed 2 motions in the interval between hearings, both aimed at establishing that the golden share was being exercised in ways inconsistent with fiduciary responsibility, which was a legal way of saying they wanted a judge to hand the keys back to someone more convenient. Sawyer appeared twice in the local business press because he couldn't fully avoid it, both times in photographs taken outside the factory in his work clothes rather than a suit, which Vaughn's people treated as evidence of unfitness and the line workers treated as evidence of something else entirely. Through all of it, Sawyer spent his evenings in the prototype facility with Betrayal and Lawson, reconstructing the Avalon 1 from available components, sourcing a replacement module through a supplier Betrayal had a direct relationship with, and working from Preston's original design files, which Sawyer had found in a locked cabinet in the archive room, behind a folder labeled in 3 languages as decommissioned reference material. There were nights when the work felt like exactly what it was: 2 engineers and a mechanic trying to prove something to a courtroom using a car as evidence. There were other nights when it felt like something the founder had planned for, had hoped for, had trusted the right person to carry through. On the 3rd to last night, Lawson found a shipping manifest in an old routing file that confirmed the Avalon's missing module had left the campus on a refrigerated parts carrier contracted to an address that matched the registered office of Holloway Mobility Trust. It was not a smoking gun in the cinematic sense. It was better. It was documentation, time-stamped and cross-referenced, the kind of evidence that does not require interpretation. Celeste spent 2 days with her financial team cross-checking Vaughn's asset valuations against the Avalon's original engineering projections and found that the proprietary platform, even in its incomplete state, represented intellectual property that the company's auditors had never been asked to include in the balance sheet. The gap between the sale price Vaughn had been steering toward and the actual recoverable value of the company's assets. If the Avalon's platform were properly assessed and the transferred patents reclaimed, was not a rounding error. On the final night, Sawyer stood in the storage facility alone for an hour before the others arrived, looking at the Avalon with the engine fully reassembled and the missing systems restored, and he thought about Nicole's voice saying he would always be a man with oil on his hands. He thought it without bitterness, the way you revisit a sentence that hurt when you first heard it and has since become something else. Not a wound, but a compass point. Because the oil on his hands was precisely the thing that had brought him to this room, and the room was precisely the thing that was going to undo everything Vaughn had built. The Avalon started on the 2nd attempt. The control panel came alive in amber and blue, the instrument cluster running through its initialization sequence with the quiet authority of technology that has been waiting, correctly maintained, for the moment when someone finally asked it to do what it was designed to do. The second hearing was larger than the first. The board was present in full, along with Sterling Quinn's legal team, financial journalists, the same cameras that had photographed Sawyer in his work clothes, and the same principals who had been in the room when the will was first read. Nicole near the back, Vaughn and Garrett at the front table, Celeste at the opposing table with Delaney Brooks and a folder that was considerably thicker than anyone on Vaughn's side had anticipated. Garrett opened with the motion to revisit the golden share transfer, arguing that Sawyer's halt of the Vera production run had cost the company 43 days of lost output, and that his management of the transition period demonstrated exactly the kind of operational inexperience the board had warned about. Delaney's response was methodical and long and left very little room. She entered Lawson's production change, log into the record. She entered the Vera material audit results, along with a third-party structural analysis confirming that the substitute bushing compound would have generated warranty claims conservatively estimated at $11 million within the first production year. She entered the shipping manifest for the Avalon's missing module. She entered the patent filing from Holloway Mobility Trust with the corresponding Mercer Sterling design brief. She entered Celeste's asset reconciliation, which calculated the total gap between Vaughn's reported valuation and the company's recoverable asset value at somewhere between $900 million and $1.4 billion, depending on how the patent dispute was resolved. And then Sawyer stood up, without theatrics, and told the court he wanted to show them something rather than describe it. The footage from the Avalon's test run, vehicle data, telemetry, performance metrics, played on the courtroom display for 4 minutes. There was no narration. The numbers were self-explanatory. When it ended, Sterling Quinn stood without being invited to do so. He said his fund had been given an incomplete picture of the company's asset base, that he had been made to understand the Avalon was a failed project with no commercial value, and that had he known what Sawyer's team had apparently uncovered in the prototype facility, he would not have been party to the proposed transaction. He sat back down. The room was very quiet. Judge Conrad Hayes looked at the material for a long moment before speaking. He confirmed, in the language of a man who has made up his mind and is now constructing the official record of that decision, that the golden share transfer was valid, that the grounds for challenge were insufficient, and that the evidentiary record would be referred to the relevant financial oversight authority for investigation of the asset valuation process and the patent transfer. He then asked Sawyer to come forward, and he lifted the silver case that had been in the court's custody since the first hearing, opened it, and placed it formally in Sawyer's hands. Vaughn Holloway Sterling's administrative access to the company's systems was suspended pending investigation. Garrett Holloway was asked by his own junior colleague, audibly, in front of the room, whether he had personal counsel retained. Nicole watched all of it from the back of the room with an expression that had moved well past regret into something more complicated, the particular look of a person who is finally understanding not just what they chose against, but why the thing they chose against had been worth more than they knew. She left before Sawyer came down the center aisle, which was probably the right call and probably the only graceful thing left available to her in that room. The weeks that followed were not cinematic. There was no single moment in which Sawyer became a different kind of man. No wardrobe change, no press conference, no scene in which he sat at a mahogany desk and made sweeping decisions. He kept the house. He kept the garage, renting it to a younger mechanic who had been looking for space, because the hours it had required were hours he no longer had in the same way. He drove Piper to school every morning in the same truck. He ate the same bad coffee from the same machine. What changed was the calendar and the responsibilities packed into it. Meetings with Celeste and the new board members, review sessions with Betrayal on the Avalon platform's development path, interviews with the legal team handling the patent reclamation, calls with Sterling Quinn's office, which was now approaching Mercer Sterling not as an acquisition target, but as a potential licensing partner. Sawyer sat in these meetings with the focused attention of a man who knows he is operating outside his native language, but refuses to pretend otherwise, asking basic questions without embarrassment, deferring to people who knew more than he did about the things they knew more about, and occasionally stopping a conversation cold with an observation about materials or process or structural logic that no one else in the room had noticed. He accepted Celeste's offer of the Heritage Oversight Chair on the condition that the factory's workforce agreements were formalized before anything else was signed, that the prototype archive received a proper institutional classification protecting it from future sale, and that the Vera production line was fully remediated before the next model year launch. Celeste agreed to all three without negotiation, which told Sawyer what she already thought about them. Nicole asked to see him one more time, and he agreed to meet her at a coffee shop on neutral ground. She did not come with an agenda in the manipulative sense. She came with the particular exhaustion of someone who has finished processing something difficult and needs to say a few things out loud before she can close the chapter. She said she was sorry for leaving when things were hard, and sorry for the specific words she had used, because she knew they had been calculated to hurt and had succeeded. Sawyer listened without interrupting. He said he accepted the apology, and he meant it, because carrying resentment toward Nicole for the rest of his life was a toll he had decided some weeks ago he was unwilling to pay. He said he hoped she would figure out what she actually wanted, separate from what other people told her she should want, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had said to her in years. He did not offer her anything beyond the conversation. The marriage was not a thing that could be repaired by circumstances having improved, and Sawyer was old enough to know that the fractures had been in the foundation, not the walls. Piper asked him that night, with the directness that children reserve for questions they have been sitting on for a while, whether they were rich now. Sawyer considered the question seriously, because she deserved that. He said they had enough, and that what was more important was that no one was going to call her father a failure again, and that she should feel free to tell anyone who tried to do so that they were incorrect. She thought about this and said okay and went back to her homework. Several months after the hearing, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with the kind of light that makes concrete look almost warm, the Mercer Sterling Motors campus came back to full production capacity for the first time in nearly 2 years. The Vera's production line ran clean. The Avalon 1, or rather, a small batch development series built on the Avalon's verified platform, was formally announced to the industry press as a limited heritage release, and the coverage was substantial. Vaughn Holloway Sterling was no longer with the company in any capacity. Garrett Holloway had retained counsel. The patent dispute with Holloway Mobility Trust was ongoing, but the preliminary findings from the financial authority had been unfavorable enough to shift the leverage significantly. Sterling Quinn's fund had not acquired Mercer Sterling, but had signed a licensing framework for 3 technology components from the Avalon platform, a transaction that, as Celeste noted during a board briefing, was worth more in isolation than the entire proposed sale had been. Sawyer kept a small office in the factory building itself, not in the executive wing, with a window that looked out over the primary assembly floor. He had kept the window on purpose. On his desk, next to a photograph of Piper at her school science fair, was the old key fob from the 3rd drawer of his tool chest. The scratch brass one with the Mercer Sterling logo that had sat beside his wedding ring on the night everything changed. It was not a trophy. It was not a symbol of defeat overcome. It was simply a thing that had been in his possession through everything, the good and the terrible and the grinding ordinary middle, and looking at it reminded him that the distance between that drawer and this desk had been measured not in money, but in a quality that could not be transferred by contract or inherited by bloodline or purchased at any price Vaughn Holloway Sterling had ever been willing to name. The line workers nodded when he walked the floor, not the nod of people acknowledging an executive, but the nod of people recognizing someone who knows what their hands are for. Betrayal stopped him one morning near the Avalon Development Bay to show him a refinement she had made to the suspension geometry, and the two of them stood there for 20 minutes going back and forth on load transfer curves, which was not a meeting that would appear in any official calendar or board record, but was, in the estimation of both participants, exactly the kind of conversation that keeps a company honest. Celeste found him there and watched for a moment before he noticed her. She said Preston had told her once, years ago, that the most dangerous thing a company could do was forget what its hands were for. Sawyer said that sounded like something Preston would say. She said it did. They stood in a comfortable silence, watching the Avalon frame move through the fixture jig, the light from the high factory windows falling across it in long parallels. And there was nothing theatrical in the moment, which was, probably, the way the founder would have wanted it. Sawyer walked out of the factory that evening through the main entrance, the heavy door swinging wide on its counterbalance, the spring air carrying the particular mix of metal and exhaust and industrial warmth that he had known since he was young. He stood for a moment on the steps with the key ring in his hand. Factory keys, archive keys, the keys to everything that had mattered to an old man who had run out of time but not out of trust. The woman who had walked out of his garage with a suitcase had watched a judge place these keys in his hands. She had watched because she happened to be in the room, and then she had walked away, which was fitting, because the story was never about her watching. The story was about what Sawyer had been all along, not the man she thought she was leaving, and not the man Vaughn had dismissed with a half-smile in a courthouse lobby, but the man Preston had been patient enough to wait for. A man with oil on his hands who knew the difference between what something was worth and what someone was trying to sell it for, and who had never, not once, confused the two. He put the keys in his pocket and walked to the truck and went home to make dinner.